summary of the causes of the Civil War that we talked about in class to help you prepare for the test. So I'm going to try to run through them pretty quickly. So here we go. Obviously, this all starts with the Constitutional Convention in that the delegates are afraid to deal with the issue of slavery. And slavery only comes up in the Constitution, well, the only important way is that slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person. And then you see at the bottom of the slide sort of major dates. So we're trying to figure out how we get to that Civil War in 1861 to 1865, which then leads eventually to the 13th Amendment, 1865, which is the end of slavery. So here's the timeline. This is the important bit on all the things we studied on how we got to the Civil War, which starts in 1861 with the shelling of Fort Sumter. And these two we did early the first day because they occur 1820, 1832, and then it gets pretty regular here, the interval here of the issues that we're going to talk about. So Missouri Compromise and nullification crisis. Missouri Compromise was very simple. Missouri wanted to be a slave state, but the northern states weren't okay with that because it would upset the balance of free to slave. So Massachusetts agrees to give up some of its territory here so that Maine can come in as a free state. So you get Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state. Both sides are happy. But when this issue comes up again, they also decide that anything south of this 3630 line, this green line here, would be slave, and anything north of it should be free. Now, good compromise, that should continue to work. We're going to find that it doesn't. And the nullification crisis in 1832 I use as a cause because it shows what happens when a state tries to nullify a federal government law. This would be the tariff that they hate. And Andrew Jackson, when South Carolina threatens to secede, sends ships down to Charleston, forces them to pay the tariff, and doesn't let them secede. In 1846, David Wilmot, a senator from Pennsylvania, decides that in the land that hopefully is won in the war of the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, when this red territory in the background here, when these states try to apply for statehood, and we have to figure out whether or not they're going to be free states or slave state, Wilmot tries to jump the gun and say, right when the war starts, and say, any of this territory won, no slave states. But obviously, in this balance that we have, maybe the northern senators and congressmen can get behind this, but the southern senators can't. And so it does pass the House a few times, but ultimately fails over the 4 years from 1846 to 1850 when we finally get California as a state, which we'll get to later. The Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo is what you're looking at here. The 1846 to 1848 war with Mexico results in this land. And this land is going to be disputed on how we get it into the Union. The other thing that happens right before the war is we get Texas as a state, and James K. Polk is responsible for that. And also he negotiates a treaty with Britain to get Oregon in as a state. So Texas is going to come in as a slave, and later on Oregon is going to come in as a free state. But what do we do with this territory in red? And the first state that's going to apply for statehood from the land won from the war with Mexico is California. And if we go back to the Missouri Compromise, what we are supposed to do with that is anything south of that green line is supposed to be a slave state, anything north of it's a free state. But California has a government, they draw up a constitution, they want to be a free state, they send it over to D.C. D.C. wants them in too because there's gold there and they stand to make a lot of money off it. So what do? So they compromise again. In this case, California comes in as a free state, and the South gets something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which is essentially an idea that any escaped slave, even if they're in the North where technically they're free, they can still be caught, sent to court, and then sent back down south to serve whatever master says they're gone, or that they escaped. And that can happen to free blacks too. And this really makes a lot of people angry, which we're going to see in our next slide with Uncle Tom's Cabin. But before I get there, the other thing we need to talk about is popular sovereignty. So much like the Missouri Compromise, California comes in a free state, much like Maine, so the North is happy. And whereas Missouri comes in a slave state, much like that, the slave state gets a Fugitive Slave Act to make them happy. This is another aspect of that, which is no more laws regarding slavery in the territories of this compromise that I want to include. But the other thing we need to talk about is popular sovereignty. So much like the Missouri Compromise, how they had a solution, which was the 3630 line, the Compromise of 1850 has a solution for future statehood, which is popular sovereignty. And it's the idea that the state and the residents of that state get to choose whether or not they want to be a free state or a slave state themselves. And that can't be changed in D.C., that it's up to the people. So the Fugitive Slave Act really drives a lot of people crazy, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is wildly popular. But also, abolitionist newspapers like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, Henry David Thoreau writes out against this. Ralph Waldo Emerson, those are your transcendentalists. So your transcendentalists and your abolitionists are very angry, especially about the Fugitive Slave Act, which can take free blacks and move them down south into slavery. Another example of these issues is the Gadsden Purchase, whereby the United States negotiates with Mexico about their southern border because it was disputed, and adds more land to the United States, which again is what's going to come up is when they want to be states, what do we do? The first time we try out popular sovereignty, the idea that these states can choose whether or not they want to be a slave or free state, happens in Kansas and Nebraska. Congress passes the KansasNebraska Act using popular sovereignty. They think Nebraska will come in as a free state, Kansas will come in as a slave state. Wrong. It's not how it goes. Popular sovereignty doesn't work. That's the point of this slide. In Lecompton and Topeka, different pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces get together, draft constitutions, send them to D.C. So D.C. gets a constitution from Lecompton saying they want to be a slave state, and a constitution from Topeka saying they want to be a free state. They don't know what to do. In addition, there's violence, physical violence going on in Kansas to try to solve this. In Lawrence, pro-slavery forces attack the city, burn the city, loot the city, etc. In response, days later, a man named John Brown, who's going to come up again later, attacks Potawatomi Creek, which is a pro-slavery village, where he literally murders pro-slavery forces in the street with a sword or a scythe or something. Historians differ. So clearly popular sovereignty is not working. Nebraska is later, much later, going to come in as a free state, and Kansas is eventually going to come in as a free state. So the idea of splitting them didn't work. Popular sovereignty didn't work. And the violence that's occurring in Kansas that proves popular sovereignty didn't work also extends to Washington, D.C., where Preston Brooks physically beats Charles Sumner over the head with his cane until he's a bloody mess on the floor of the Senate chamber because Charles Sumner spoke out against what's going on, what he calls the crime against Kansas, and insulted Preston Brooks' uncle about his allegiance to slavery. So that doesn't work. So this is violence in the Senate chamber. In the Judiciary, another one of the branches of government, they get a chance to make a ruling on slavery, and they don't. Dred Scott says he should be a free man because he's residing in free states, but he had moved from a slave state. However, the Supreme Court doesn't just shoot down this idea that he should be a free man, but they say, actually, you're not a citizen because you're an African American, and therefore you can't use the rights granted in the Constitution to citizens. One of those rights is indeed the use of the Supreme Court. So not only is he not free because he moved from a slave state to a free state with his master, but he also can't use the courts at all. So can the judiciary help us at the national level solve slavery? No. Violence in the legislature, judiciary is kicking the can down the road. We're going to get more violence. John Brown, the same guy who committed the violence in Potawatomi Creek in Kansas, leads a slave revolt in Harper's Ferry. It does not work. He gets captured by U.S. troops, one of whom is actually Robert E. Lee. And he gets stabbed in that altercation, but eventually he gets hung for treason. And right before he's hanged, he says, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And he's correct on that. We're going to have a civil war. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of blood to solve this issue. Of course, last of these causes is Abraham Lincoln's election. That's the last straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, with respect to secession. After Lincoln is elected, and as you see on this slide, he doesn't win a single southern state. Democrats are all split up over there. There's 3 candidates down south, really, that get some votes. Lincoln does not have to win a southern state to get elected. This really bothers the southern states, and South Carolina secedes. South Carolina thinks that Abraham Lincoln's going to take slavery away from them, when in fact that is not Abraham Lincoln's policy. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, which is new this election, the first time they won a presidency, they vow to stop the spread of slavery. They're not trying to get rid of slavery, they're trying to stop the spread of slavery. But it doesn't matter, South Carolina seceded, and Lincoln can't do what Jackson did, way back in the day, because South Carolina has support. 7 states have seceded before Lincoln sits in office, and eventually, when Lincoln tries to hold on to federal land in South Carolina, the war begins. South Carolina opens fire on a Union, or in this case, a U.S. fort in Charleston to try to take it because they seceded. And the white flag comes up from this fort from Major Anderson, who would be the U.S. or Union general here. And these are the first shots of the war in April 14th of 1861. And the 7 states that seceded get joined by others when Lincoln calls for troops to fight this war. And the slave states that are in red are the Confederate states that get together to fight the Civil War. Those in light blue are border states that had slavery but did not secede from the Union. And then the blue states is the Union. Civil War, 4-year war, tons of death, lots of blood. That'll be our next unit. Hope this helps you summarize the causes of the Civil War. And good luck studying this stuff for your test.